All right, so we're on. And today, me and Brianna Damon, myself, David Olea, will be talking about one of our books in our class, Reclaiming Our Stories, and just the importance of what it means to represent this demographic in literature and how we feel about it. Because me and her have very different perspectives. And so I'll introduce myself first. My name is David Olea, as my classmates know me and our professor. I grew up in a very low income household. I've been through the whole thing, Section 8, stuff like that. So I very much grew up in the Southeast. I'm very aware that these stories are very true. And then, Brianna, if you want to introduce yourself.
So I'm Brianna Damon. I grew up in Chula Vista, in a middle income household actually. So I do have some awareness of the stories that are told in this book, but not as in depth as David's would be, I believe. So we're going to be discussing that together.
Yeah, so we thought it would be interesting to just kind of share and contrast how these ideas, how we perceive them and just what we experience and the way we take it in, because I'm sure there's a lot of us out there that didn't even know that these type of areas existed. So we think it's important to bring awareness to San Diego. So I guess what we wanted to talk about first is kind of like the importance of more than one story. And do you want to go ahead and start?
Basically just having this diversity told like within this novel. Like there's a lot of different perspectives in here, like from people of different genders, races, religions, even sexualities, and just people coming from like different backgrounds as a whole. And it's really important for people of all ages really to hear these stories, learn about these stories, just become more aware and well-rounded and do their best to like fight for people to like have more justice, because a lot of the things in this book are very sad and things that we should be paying more attention to within our country.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that these are the type of stories that are not, to tell you the truth, they don't have a happy ending. So it's sad because you read these and you're always hoping, some of them do obviously do hear some positivity in there. And as we heard in our discussion with the actual authors of them, but a lot of them just don't have an exit. A lot of these people are just stuck there in this system that keeps you trapped, and you're just it's hard to describe because personally I feel like I escaped and I still look back on it, and it's kind of sad to think that even obviously my family is there, so it's difficult to think of how I can help them and get better and everything. But I think that's what people don't realize the most. It's that it's just really hard to get out of that and somehow manage to build a life for yourself, because coming from poverty, you don't ever have a safety net. That's the truth. So we kind of want to start it with sharing our favorite stories, and we'll kind of go with the flow and see where it goes from there. You want to start with yours?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So we're back. Had some technical issues, and we were just about to address one of the stories that you were talking about, right? That you found interesting.
Yeah, so I wanted to discuss To Give Myself a Chance, which was written by Sierra Robinson. And the story is about a sex worker who unfortunately isn't given justice in her situation. So she was forced into sex work. It wasn't her choice, it was against her will. And the justice system failed her. They ended up charging her as a criminal for basically being partners with her pimp, as like said in the story. And this is still an issue that goes on in our country today. Like a lot of women are forced into this situation and unfortunately don't ever really receive justice for it. And some of them like will just end up serving prison time for many years, and it negatively impacts their life. Like they don't get justice, they don't get help for something that they're put into against their will. And it's something that we as a country should pay more attention to and put more effort into helping these women, because it's not something that they chose for themselves.
So I guess if I could ask you a question about this story, because I know this issue is kind of sensitive with a lot of older folks,
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say that is because people, especially, and then obviously there is a lot of progressive older people, but I've noticed, at least personally, I've noticed that a lot of older people do not approve of sex work, or they just look down on it and don't really know the circumstances. So I would just say that is
I think it's just really old-fashioned values and like old-fashioned like religious beliefs as well, like being very strict in that sense, because a lot of people just believe like if a woman is involved in that sort of thing, like they're bad, you know, like it's something that they just shouldn't be doing. But in reality, like in the modern day sense, like women should be able to be sexually liberated and like do what they want with their bodies. And then especially in this case, like this wasn't her choice and it happens a lot. And even still, like people don't see the injustice in that or how unfair it is
Right.
and that they actually need help.
And it's funny because if we flip that narrative and it's targeted towards men, then it's, I feel like people like, oh, it's not that big a deal then, and I don't
Yeah.
know. It's just a shame. So I don't know. It's difficult to really approach any. That's what I find the most difficult, to try to approach someone that seems stuck in their ways. Like, how do you really, change their mind? Or I feel like they would have to see tragedy itself to really understand it.
Mm-hmm. And then I think we should probably go into the story that you chose.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I actually have it open. So my story is, well, my favorite story, and it's gonna sound depressing, but it's the 5 weeks one. I have it right here, and it's by Mary Coleman. And I chose this story as my favorite because even though I know it is depressing, and obviously this person had a lot of future, that they still are gonna have like experience, but strangely enough for me, it does feel like it gives a bit of hope. So if you guys don't remember it, and I'll go ahead and remind you, it's a story about Mary Coleman who experiences a stroke and she loses feeling in her left arm and she can't move it. And then her mother ends up passing away. But I really loved the last couple lines where she says, here, let me read it. So in a mere 5 weeks, my world had shattered, and it would take the grace of God blessing me with the love and support of family and friends to carry me through until I found the will, let alone the strength, to start putting the pieces back together again. So it's just saying a lot about, just human vulnerability and how we tend to pull through a lot of crazy things, like, especially like when you experience tragedy like that, it's not easy to start over again. But just the fact that she had the strength to go ahead and went through this trauma and she's willing to try again, it's just saying a lot about us, like we're very privileged. Like even me, sure, I can complain about what I've been through, but I'm very privileged. I'm thankful that I'm healthy and stuff. So it just really impacted me really differently. Like obviously a lot of props to Mary and her writing, and I'm sure she's still very much going through it, but the fact she's trying is already saying a lot against a lot of us who don't really, sometimes we take life for granted, I guess. So I really appreciated that story.
Yeah.
Sorry, it sounded on a depressed, a little bit of a depressive note, but. And then I guess we kind of wanted to talk about what we can really do to help people understand. And I personally think that this book is just a great insight, like just a great dive into that, because people don't know these stories. Anybody living above the 8 west, or I mean the up north a little bit of San Diego, has never heard of the Southeast. It's the truth. Like people didn't even know that gang banging was a thing, or people were still bringing guns to school, and those things are very real and they're still happening. So I think this book is a very important first step into bringing a voice to those type of people. And personally, that's why I love this book so much. Is there anything you want to add to that, or?
Just to say, like, in combination, like, with this book, just to keep telling stories of, like, POC and, like, women and just underrepresented groups. Like, it's really important for people to hear these stories and learn more. That way, like, hopefully this world can become more accepting and more knowledgeable.
And then the last thing of our little podcast that we thought would be interesting to do is, since we have contrasting views, well, not really views, we very much agree to what we believe about this book, but we think it'd be interesting to answer some of the questions, just so you guys could see how much of a difference living in, just across the freeway makes. So there's questions on the back of the book, and we'll be covering them, and I'll be answering them, and then she'll be answering them as well, so you guys could see the difference in how we grew up and stuff. So the first one is describe the role of gangs in our community in your life. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, so basically, where I grew up, this was really not a worry of mine at all. I didn't really have to fear like walking through my neighborhood. Like, I would walk home from school, and it was like maybe like a 15-minute walk. I never felt unsafe. Like, our community was like very like family oriented, so I never had to worry about this type of violence in my life. Well, I know, like, I think David's experience was very different from mine on the other hand.
Well, obviously, I don't experience that anymore, but back when I was growing up, it was very much like you should not be out late at night unless you knew a group of people, or definitely shouldn't be wearing certain colors. Should never wear a bandana, like, ever. Small things like that that I got very much accustomed to, and once you grow up and you go to college and you step outside of that world, you realize that those things aren't real. Like, they're not. Well, they are very real and they're happening, but they're not how the world actually happens outside of that area. So it's just interesting to me, I guess. And it's kind of sad that people are still experiencing that today in San Diego. The next question is, have you or someone you ever known been impacted by the criminal justice system?
And I would say no. So I haven't really had much experience with that. Even with the police in general, any experiences that people I've known that have had with them have always been just fine. Like, nothing ever truly negative has ever come out of it.
And then for me, I have known a couple of my cousins, and I guess it sounds funny because we're gonna keep saying yes and no,
Yeah.
but it's just a reality. Like, these things aren't jokes. And it's the same thing for me. I've had a couple friends arrested for misdemeanor, like just small, like marijuana charges or stuff like that, and they've had to go to juvie. And I hope they're still doing well, but these are real things. Um, the next one is going to be, how would people describe your neighborhood, and would you agree with their descriptions? How does the reality of your neighborhood match or challenge other people's assumptions?
So, weirdly enough, like, the description of where I live varies from person to person. Like me personally, like, I see my neighborhood as like a very nice area, to be honest. But there are other areas like within Chula Vista that are more updated, I guess I could say, wealthier areas in Chula Vista that see where I live specifically and say that it's ghetto, or like, oh, everything's so old over there, it looks so weird. Like, people really be like saying stuff like that, and it's pretty shocking just because I've been to areas, I guess, that you could say like are poorer than where I grew up, and I've seen it, and just I still feel comfortable in those places. So it's just weird to hear other people just like making those quick assumptions and not wanting to be anywhere near like where I lived. So it's just very odd, I guess I could say.
I guess I'll answer that as well, and I think I could describe it this way. So one of the most vivid and funny, I guess I think it's funny, but one of the oldest memories I had is when we had a football game when I was in high school, and there was a lot of people from the other college team because I guess they were very popular, and me and my friends were also watching the football game, and we could overhear them, and they're like, "Oh, what if somebody brought a gun?" And they were complaining about how they were scared, which obviously is a very, I mean, we were laughing because we knew that that wasn't gonna happen because it's just a football game, but we were also aware that that's a very much a reality. So we were laughing because we were used to it, but they weren't. And it's just funny to look back on it and to see how people perceived my school and just our neighborhood in general. And then one of the next ones we're going to talk about is, do you want to read it?
So how has your race and ethnicity, we're gonna kind of combine these two questions actually. So how has your race and ethnicity impacted your life, and also how has your appearance affected your life or how people treat you?
This is very complex. I feel like that we could talk so much about this
Yeah.
because race and identity is just a very complex issue. Personally, for me, I won't lie, I struggled a lot with identity, and it really wasn't until I actually stepped into college and I had, POC professors that were able to kind of guide me in the right way and tell me what or who, not exactly, obviously, they're not going to tell me who I am, but they could guide me and make me understand that it's more than just a white centric world out there. Like, there's very much authors of my skin color, and it's crazy because I think about it and like I've never, I guess the way I could say it is that I've never, now I would never struggle with that, but back then I would be ashamed of small things like the color of my skin, ashamed of being Hispanic, and you don't realize those things, and you don't realize why those things happen. You know, you do small things like read a book and assume every character is white, stuff like that, that you don't realize why you're doing it. And it wasn't until, or even like, I know it sounds silly right now, but even like being ashamed of my accent, stuff like that to me back then was normal, and I understood why I was doing it, but not really. Like now I look back on it, I'm like, why was I doing this? Why was I ashamed of myself? And the truth is that you're just don't, you're afraid of not fitting in a world where you're not supposed to be in. If that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense or so. Obviously now I look at it very different. I'm very proud to be who I am, but identity is just such a complex issue for, you know, people who don't really belong anywhere. So it's just something that I wanted everybody to consider.
So for me, on the other hand, it's pretty different. I am half white and half Mexican, so depending where I'm at, like people will be like, "Oh, she's white," or "Oh, she's Mexican." It kind of just depends on the person or what area I'm in. But in relation to that, I weirdly enough, even though I do have like minority blood in me, I have led a very privileged existence in that sense. Just because growing in Chula Vista is a majority Mexican population, and my high school was majority other Mexican people as well. So I never felt excluded or like the odd one out in that sense because I had so many friends and people around me that shared that same culture with me. But I didn't really notice how different I was, I guess, until I went to university. Like seeing how many like white people were around. It was just very interesting, like, because I was very much used to like having a lot of POC around me and like people with like similar backgrounds and like having the need to work. Like you need to work. Like that was something that was so weird to me. Like I would go to school and so many kids there didn't need to work. Like they'd just be provided for by their parents, which is like very interesting to me. And like I found even just like in classes, like weirdly enough, like somehow like I would befriend or just gravitate towards people that shared similar backgrounds with me. So it's just interesting to think about.
And then I think we'll do one more question and probably end the podcast. So the last one we're gonna do is, what experiences have you had with the police, border patrol, and law enforcement in general? I feel like this kind of pertains to skin color stuff. And do you want to start or should I start?
I can start. So once again, like I think I mentioned earlier, like I've personally never had any experience really with law enforcement. Um, like I guess if even if I were to like approach an officer, like I'd imagine they'd receive me pretty well. Like I probably wouldn't have to worry too much about an interaction that I would have with them, which is a very big privilege that I have.
So I think at least almost all POC can say that they've experienced, unfortunately, I would hope not everybody, but they have a general mistrust for law enforcement. And it's not done on purpose. I think that's what I want people to understand, that it's not done on purpose. It's done due to, you know, like when you're little, like your family tells you, hey, be careful because you're not really, you're not, you know, like they look for you, like they look for your skin color. It doesn't feel that way. And it sounds very much like stereotypical to say something like that, but, and I didn't want to believe it, I promise you guys. Like I just thought, I was very ignorant back then, at least of what was going on around me. So I would say, no, if I'm a good person and if I'm careful. And it wasn't until I was like maybe a little older that I accidentally bumped into a police officer and they're like, what the fuck are you doing? Or it was just very aggressive, almost pushed me for no reason type of demeanor, that I realized that I did nothing wrong, but suddenly this guy's almost willing to arrest me, you know? And obviously, well, not obviously, but I've definitely had very negative experience with Border Patrol. But that's a whole nother story for another day. I think we're gonna end it right here, unless you have some final comments.
I think we're basically done discussing, but just to reiterate, just the importance of talking about these stories and even addressing these questions that we just went over, like at the back of the book. Like, these are things that everyone should talk about and discuss. I think it's really important.
Yeah, we didn't want to just highlight like, oh, she didn't go through it, or I didn't go through it. It's not about that. I think it's about noting that, hey, we're very much close in age, you know, and we grew up in basically the same county, but there are very different things going on, you know? And I think that's our final concluding point for today.
Yeah.